Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Plains Climate Science webinar series. The South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the South Central CASC, began this webinar series in 2019 as a platform to highlight our center's funded projects, which cover the diverse ecoregions of Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana. The South Central CASC is one of 9 regional CASCs that provide science, tools, and information through partnerships and collaboration with our cultural and natural resource managers, helping them address the impacts of climate change and variability in the areas of their focus. I'm one of your hosts, Cody Nguyen, an ORISE participant with the center. With me today is Marina Tomer, who I will hand it over for her to introduce herself and our guest speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Marina Tomer, and I'm the Acting Assistant Regional Administrator on the USGS arm of the South Central CASC. As Cody mentioned, a core mission of our center is to fund actionable climate adaptation science that meets the needs of natural and cultural resource managers within our region of New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. This morning, we're thrilled to share with you 3 of the fiscal year 2024 projects that the South Central CASC has funded as part of our project solicitation process. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Katie Powlen. She's a USGS geographer at the Oklahoma-Texas Water Science Center. She's a social scientist who studies human-environment interactions aimed at understanding drivers of land use decisions, water insecurity, and vulnerability to hazards. And her project is focused on identifying opportunities to strengthen climate resilience in flood-prone, underserved communities. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Gholizadeh, who's an associate professor in geography at Oklahoma State University. He's also co-director of the Center for Applications of Remote Sensing, where he works to use remote sensing techniques to enhance our understanding of grasslands ecosystems and their biodiversity. And he'll be presenting on his project, which is focused on optimizing invasive plant management in grasslands. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Jeremy Ross, who's an associate professor at the Oklahoma Biological Survey here at the University of Oklahoma. And his research is primarily focused on ecology and conservation issues related to species and their habitats, as well as sustainable landscapes and severe weather ecology. And his project is focused on empowering tribal nations to plan for extreme climate change threats. So with that, we'd like to thank our 3 speakers for sharing your time and expertise with us this morning. And thank you again for attending. And I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Katie Powlen.
And thank you for the introduction already. As Marina said, I'm Katie. I'm a human environment geographer with USGS at the Oklahoma-Texas Water Science Center. The project that I'll be talking about today aims to strengthen climate resilience in underserved communities in Harris County, Texas. The project just got started a few months ago, and we're planning to continue for the next 3 years. So urban flooding is a concern across much of the U.S. Flooding is currently estimated to cause billions of dollars of damage in the U.S. annually. The exact estimate ranges from 2 to 30 to even over $100 billion annually, as seen in a recent report from the Joint Economic Committee. Climate change is increasing the probability of extreme events, including heavy precipitation events and tropical storms. This is especially a concern for the South Central U.S. and is a growing concern as we continue to see oceans warm, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. So these changes, along with growing populations and increasing urbanization, will exacerbate urban flooding issues into the future, and adaptation responses will be critical for urban climate resilience. There are a range of structural solutions that can be implemented to reduce flood risk. This includes things like levees or dams or natural drainage areas. But in some cases, these structural solutions cannot effectively reduce flood risk. And in these cases, projects like property acquisition programs or flood buyouts have been seen as a last resort. So in a buyout program, a homeowner that has experienced repeated flood loss is provided funds to move out of that flood-prone property and relocate outside of a flood zone. The most common buyout programs are typically voluntary. Most of them are federally funded from grants through FEMA or HUD. and they're typically administered through local governments. So in these buyout programs, in addition to sort of removing this single property from flood hazards, in cases with continued investment, these purchase lots can be restored to things like green space, which provide natural flood mitigation benefits to the surrounding areas and any remaining individuals, as well as potentially providing a number of other ecosystem services and well-being benefits. So Harris County, Texas has a long history of catastrophic floods and tropical storms. They also have the highest concentration of flood buyouts in the US so far, with more than 3,000 properties purchased since the program began in the mid-'80s and spending over $30 million to purchase those properties. So these buyouts can be seen on the map on the slide with the red dots. Each of those red dots is a purchased home, and that has been overlaid with FEMA's flood data for some hazard context. Additionally, a timeline of when these purchases have been made can be seen on the slide in relation to some of the major flooding events for the county. So kind of as we expect, a lot of the purchased properties are either directly in a floodway or they're in the 1% annual exceedance zone. And also, because these properties because these programs are voluntary and typically funding is released for them after a natural disaster declaration, you can also see some temporal patterns in sort of when they're purchased, specifically that participation in the programs or the total counts of properties purchased tends to spike after a major event. So while the county has made substantial progress in reducing the number of residents at risk of flooding, it's really only scratched the surface. Harris County and Houston have a long history of poor land use planning, as well as a very extensive network of bayous, which cover the entire county. And this has put an estimated quarter of the county's land area at risk of flooding. So to address this issue, many more structural and non-structural projects will be needed for countywide climate resilience, and this will, of course, require substantial financial investment. In fact, the county, the flood control district who run the buyout project has estimated that they need $1 billion just to complete the high priority buyout programs. So this is an infographic that depicts sort of where they have identified these high priority buyout areas, as well as the criteria that they base that decision on. So this is based on the source of flooding, the location and the depth of flooding of each private residence, the cost effectiveness of a buyout versus implementing a different type of mitigation strategy, as well as compatibility with community values, natural values, and any future flood mitigation projects that the flood district has planned for the future. So given how large this challenge is, how much this is going to cost, as well as how long this will take to carry out, our project is aiming to help further refine this strategy by incorporating additional factors that are important for understanding equitable flood mitigation, such as how a community may be able to respond to these flooding effects, as well as how flooding may change in the future under a changing climate. So we plan to accomplish this doing sort of three main components. The first is to advance our understanding of the flooding exposure and how it may change under different climate scenarios. So we plan to use downscaled CMIP6 climate data from the South Central CASC Climate Projections Evaluation Project, or their CPREP project. And this will provide future precipitation estimates for us to use in our flood models. For the flood modeling, we'll be taking the existing 1D HECRAS models that the Flood Control District currently uses, and we'll develop 2D rain-on-grid HECRAS models. The two-dimensional models are more suitable for this project due to their ability to simulate complex flow patterns and handle the complex geometry of urban areas better than the existing 1D models. So we plan to use these 2D models in order to map the future extent and depth of flooding under two different emission scenarios, a medium and a high emission scenario. And then we plan to compare those outputs to current flood estimates, as well as the current buyout priority areas. There'll also be sort of a geospatial component to this project, and it will help us understand how these purchase lots are being restored post-buyout. So ultimately, the objective of a buyout is to remove this household from risk and then allow that lot to return to its natural state to be able to dynamically respond to flooding. So at the very least, removing that house and removing that impervious cover can increase the drainage capacity for that plot. In cases where you see many houses being purchased together, sort of clustered buyouts, as you can see from the example on this slide, which is in North Houston, it increases the opportunity for additional benefits. So in these situations, some of these areas can be converted to either community parks or new habitat for a variety of species, or even used as sort of an area for a structural solution like a drainage area. Oops. Didn't mean to move on. So we plan to use Landsat imagery to calculate an enhanced vegetation index, which will help us understand how these purchase lots are being used. So we're interested in understanding sort of how they're being restored, how any new green space is connected to wider county green space efforts, as well as potentially trying to quantify the flood mitigation benefits that this land conversion is providing to the county. So conversely, we could also find that little restoration is taking place on these purchase lots. And in those cases, we'll use that information to identify new areas for flood mitigation or potentially nature-based solutions into the future. And then the third piece of this project will look a little closer at who is being affected. So two key components to climate vulnerability frameworks are sensitivity and adaptive capacity, or how susceptible a community is to the climate threat and how or if they're able to respond to this threat. So there are many social vulnerability indices as well as flood vulnerability indices that already exist. To not reinvent the wheel, we plan to get a strong understanding of what's already been done in existing literature and a strong understanding of the relationships that have already been documented between different climate or between different community characteristics and flood vulnerability. And then we'll use that information and go collect secondary data to map those characteristics across Harris County to try to better understand who may be more vulnerable socially to these flooding threats into the future, based on varying sensitivities or varying levels of the ability to respond to flooding threats. So this slide just gives one example of those existing indices from the CDC, the Social Vulnerability Index, just to demonstrate sort of how these different levels of different levels of vulnerability can vary across the county. And the buyouts or the purchase properties are laid on top of that to give an idea of sort of where they've been invested in so far. And then finally, because these programs are voluntary and they require homeowner buy-in to be successful, we also aim to get a better understanding of these high priority targeted homeowners' hesitations or sort of main concerns with the program. So understanding some of the major limitations to enrollment can help potentially better design more effective program strategies. Of course, some of these logistics may be able to be accounted for and adjusted in project planning, but of course we expect some to be a little more challenging to address just based on what's in existing literature. So, and we know that some existing limitations could be related to community ties, a sense of place, or intergenerational connections to these areas. But nonetheless, we think sort of all hesitations or sort of limitations to enrollment are important to be documenting to understand sort of if the project can be more successful or why there's been sort of hesitation to buy in so far to protect those residents. So we plan to gather these perspectives by attending public meetings on buyouts, either held by the Flood Control District or by community groups such as the Harris County Community Flood Resilience Task Force. Additionally, we'll be qualitatively coding public comments from previous public meetings to gather this information as well. And then we plan to combine all of this information into a single report that outlines pathways for increasing flood resiliency across the county. This is going to be shared with our project partners, including the Flood Control District, and hopefully used to inform and further refine their current prioritization strategy, which focuses more heavily on just sort of flooding exposure and whether those homes are inside or outside of a floodplain. With that, I just want to say thank you, as well as acknowledge and thank my other two project members. So Namjung Choi and Nathan Paisley are both with the USGS Oklahoma Texas Water Science Center and on this project with me.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was a great presentation. We are going to now transition to Dr. Ahmed Gholizadeh, who is presenting on optimizing invasive plant management in grasslands.
Thank you very much, Cody, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed Gholizadeh. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Oklahoma State University, and today I'm presenting a brief introduction of our project on optimizing management of invasive plants in grasslands ecosystems using remote sensing and climate sciences. I'm presenting this on behalf of our team. So by some estimates, grasslands are estimated to cover about 25 to 40% of the Earth's land surface. But unfortunately, they are one of the most undervalued, understudied, and under threat ecosystems. And in fact, grassy biomes are predicted to be the ecosystems hardest hit by the ongoing climate crisis, especially when coupled with other threats, mainly human disturbances. So when we have ongoing climate change coupled with human disturbances, we will have other major threats. And one of the biggest threats to grassy biomes worldwide is the threat of biological invasions. For example, with increasing variability in precipitation and temperature, there will be more pressure on native plant communities in grasslands, which in turn can significantly enhance the threat of biological invasions. So in order to address this problem, this issue, we need sustainable and scalable monitoring approaches to manage invasive plants in naturally assembled grasslands. And this is our ultimate goal. In this project, we are planning to develop a scalable approach to improve the management of an invasive plant in grassland ecosystem. But this is not a straightforward goal to achieve. There are several challenges. The main challenges that I want to mention here is one of them is that the impact of climate factors on invasive plants is spatially complex. For example, while some aspects of climate change can promote biological invasions in one place, they might prohibit biological invasions in other places. And the second challenge is that if we want to monitor and study invasive species using field observations, we probably won't be able to cover large areas and long time periods, primarily because traditional field-based observations have really limited spatial and temporal coverage. These are the two main challenges that we think we need to address to achieve our ultimate goal. We are planning to address these challenges, to overcome these challenges through a novel integration of climate sciences, remote sensing, and ecological modeling. And in this project specifically, we are focusing on an invasive plant called Lespedeza cuneata. So Lespedeza cuneata is a scientific name for this invasive plant. It has a few common names. For example, some people refer to this plant as Ceresia. But in this talk, I'm just going to simply refer to this plant with its scientific name, Lespedeza cuneata. And in order to give you an idea how this plant looks like, I'm going to show you a short video that we shot a few years ago in one of our study sites. So you see that dark green patch in the middle. That's one example of Lespedeza cuneata patch. And here's another one right in front of you at the bottom left of this slide. This is another patch of Lespedeza cuneata. The story behind this invasive plant is quite interesting. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but we can discuss it in more detail through in the Q&A. But briefly, this plant was brought to the US in 1890s to be used as a cheap forage to feed cattle, also to be used to control for soil erosion. Unfortunately, things didn't work out as planned, and now this plant has become a major invasive species in many grasslands across the US. For example, on this map, you can see some regions shown in green. These are the counties where this invasive plant has been observed. As of now, this plant has been observed in more than 20 states in the US, and it is a major problem in several of these states like Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, and it is significantly impacting landowners in several of these states. And the phrases that you see on this slide, this is what I found on local articles and online. This is how landowners describe this invasive plant: the top nightmare plant, greedy grass, Finnish. In many cases, managing for Lespedeza cuneata represents the largest land management cost for many landowners. So of course, something needs to be done. To partially address some of these issues and problems, we defined three objectives in this project. The first objective was developing a scalable and adaptable approach for direct detection of actual Lespedeza cuneata invasion using remote sensing technology. The second objective was identifying climatic factors that can help Lespedeza cuneata spread. And the third objective, which is probably the most important objective, is identifying habitats vulnerable to Lespedeza cuneata invasion under future climate scenarios using species distribution modeling. To make sure our research findings are communicated with end users and stakeholders. In this project, we have an application partner, Director Robert Hamilton, the director of the Tallgrass Initiative in Oklahoma, who is with the Oklahoma Nature Conservancy. Director Hamilton has decision-making authority and works closely with private landowners and tribal nations in the region. We have been working with Director Hamilton for several years now, since 2019. And part of the objectives that we defined in this project is from direct input from Director Hamilton. We also have an application liaison in our team. One of our co-PIs, Dr. Samuel Follendorf, has extensive experience communicating research findings with landowners in the region. So he will have the role of application liaison in this project. We will also leverage the already existing networks in the region. For example, the Prayer Project and the OSU's Natural Resources Extension to make sure that our findings are communicated with broader number of landowners in the region. We also hope that as a result of this project, we will be able to use novel Earth observation, data, and climate sciences to enhance decision-making activities. Landowners use a variety of different management practices to control the spread of invasive species. For example, some of them use prescribed fire, some use mowing, some use application of herbicide, some of them use grazing. But what we do not know is how effective these approaches are across large spatial domains and over time, primarily because these approaches have been mainly tested across really small spatial areas, really small regions, and usually over one or a few points in time. So through integrating remote sensing and climate sciences, we aim to find out how if these management practices are effective at controlling the spread of invasive species. We have assembled a team of experts with expertise in remote sensing, climate sciences, and range and management. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have an application partner in our team. So I'm going to wrap up here. I want to thank you all for listening and looking forward to our Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Gholizadeh. Up next, we will have Dr. Jeremy Ross, and he will be sharing on his project, Empowering Tribal Nations to Plan for Extreme Climate Change Threats.
Okay. Thank you all for having me, and big thanks to the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center for supporting this project. It's not just me here, that we have a lot of co-PIs on this project that are listed here. I'll introduce them again as we go through this, as well as partners. But to give you some background of why this was important, well, a climate challenge we face, and in fact here in Oklahoma we faced it for the last few days, are climate extremes. And so as we're moving into this new era of climate extremes, we can have this whiplash between things like flash droughts and flash flooding, like Oklahoma has been experiencing over the last few months. Natural ecosystems can bounce back. They can have so-called resilience, or they can recover after there's been damage. But it all depends upon what tolerance limits there are within those ecosystems, how long those extreme conditions last. So does the mighty oak last through these poor conditions? If not, under recovery, whether or not an ecological system can recover depends upon whether or not they have a sufficient source of recolonizers, and whether or not there's going to be enough resources available at the destination. So for agroecosystems, this might involve something like how many seeds you have, whether or not the conditions are conducive to what you want to grow. So again, agroecosystems are essentially that interplay between human uses of mostly plants, but also animals, within the natural ecosystem. So this jiving between the two of them. For Native American tribes, they are a central part of their cultures. With those nations coming from the U.S. Midwest and Southeast, they have a lot of plant species and crops that were brought here to Oklahoma. But you have very different climatic norms here in Oklahoma that those crops could be facing. So under these forecasts for climatic extremes to become, more extreme, more widespread, longer lasting, it could potentially be impacting these culturally important agroecosystems. So I do want to introduce the entire team here of investigators. On the kind of conservation biology side of this is James Hung and Laura Souza here at the Oklahoma Biological Survey / School of Biological Sciences. This kind of leaks over into Jane Breckenridge, who is also a proponent of conservation biology, more so at the forefront of applications. Down at the bottom, Diana Denham and Justin Reedy are leading these so-called deliberative discussions, kind of thinking about the social aspects of developing action plans. And then Jason Vogel and Yvette. Hi, Yvette. I see you're on here in terms of water quality. But Yvette will also be involved with deliberative discussions as the tribal liaison for the South Central CASC. So key partners and end users. Well, Jane comes back in here as an end user and definitely a key partner. Her and her husband, David Bolkin, pictured here at their facility south of Tulsa, are definitely partners on this project. You might know their names from their involvement with Natives Raising Natives and the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators. So their organization does a lot of outreach with Native communities. It is Native owned and Native run. And a big part of what they do is they go out and they collect seeds, clean those seeds, germinate them, and distribute them to tribal members within Oklahoma. Another key partner on the project will be the Kickapoo tribe of Oklahoma, and Darian Shields is our contact there. They're particularly interested in the application of wastewater gardens. I'll get into those in a second, but trying to think about how to source the cattails that they use for their traditional housing, because right now during droughts here in Oklahoma, they might have to travel as far as Texas or even into Mexico to source those and bring them back in order to build these houses every year. Definitely a key partner in this whole process is Dr. Mark Nelson, who was really a pioneer in thinking about water resource usage under stressful conditions. His stressful condition was living in Biosphere 2. This was the project in southern Arizona in the early 1990s, and he basically pioneered this ability to recycle that water back into plants, clean that water, and he'll be an integral part in leading this project going forward. So engaging with stakeholders, a big engagement that we're going to do as a central part of this is the development of this so-called extreme climate action plan for culturally important agroecosystems, or the CAPSIA. And what I've drawn here is an approximation of what we anticipate coming up with, but it is going to be a stakeholder-driven process that's fueled by so-called deliberative discussions, talking about what matters to tribes, what is known about what historically has been done to mitigate or to adapt to extreme climatic conditions. So, for instance, on the upper left-hand side, for heat that might exacerbate itself into wildfires, what are some of the potential adaptive measures that we could take in terms of managing how much sunlight comes into agroecosystems, all the way up to these wastewater gardens I keep on talking about, to winds and flash flooding and rainfall. So it is a process that will emerge. These are just suggestions of where they could go, but ultimately it's going to be led by the community so that we can develop these action plans so that we can plan ahead and then respond to extreme climatic events. The wastewater gardens I keep talking about are geared towards reusing fresh water as much as we can. And when it comes to areas that have so-called wastewater, these could be septic, this could be gray water, trying to use those for other purposes. So a wastewater garden is specifically geared towards trying to use that for targeted plant growth. It is a submerged flow constructed wetland that is EPA approved, and it is another way to treat water and reuse it at the same time. This is an approach that has been proven by science. It has gained popularity, and there's a number of proponents out there, including Dr. Mark Nelson and Dr. Andrew Millison. And this is in the public's mind in terms of what we can do to lessen our footprint. It is also something that can be used for community engagement and allowing people to have an alternative a way of treating wastewater. So in this example from Algeria, Wastewater Gardens International, that's Dr. Mark Nelson's outfit, created this system that was not only functional, but it was also aesthetically pleasing in terms of integrating the crescent moon design in this environment. My personal involvement, I've actually made one of these wastewater gardens in my backyard, and it is quite wonderful and quite productive. And especially, you can see the value in it not in May, not really in May, but in mid-September, when, say, for instance, in the south central region, we start to get these flash droughts. That when everything else is browning around it, these gardens continue to be productive and continue to attract pollinators and continue to be able to produce seed from these targeted plants. So in terms of deliverables, of course, going through these gardens, we will be monitoring water quality and thinking about how they are truly functioning as a secondary water treatment, as well as monitoring the soil, making sure that no pathogens are migrating up towards the surface. So following the lead of Mark Nelson and others, looking at things like biological oxygen demand, phosphorus and nitrogen content within that water, both coming in and leaving the system, as well as how much water is leaving the system through evapotranspiration. So going up through plants and hopefully spurring that growth of those targeted plants. At the same time, on the biologist side, we're going to be looking at how these plants are growing, especially under water stress, uh, looking at the nutritional value of nectar and pollen for pollinator communities, and then especially from the cultural standpoint, looking at the seed quality, making sure that these seeds are strong, they are going to germinate well, because the purpose is really through, especially drought, that we can ensure that there is a seed bank being produced year after year. So if there is a severe drought here in Oklahoma, those people who planted their culturally important species in the ground aren't, at the risk of losing those species or those strains. So coming back to it, we will be producing this Ecapsia, trying to learn how to increase readiness within the community. So we'll be studying the process, because coming up with an action plan for climate change is a very broad topic. So focusing in on specific events and specific things that we can do about them for agroecosystems could be that seed from which larger planning projects can be done. We can develop tangible action plans that can be put in place here in the South Central region. Of course, it can involve the community members, either if it's at small residential type of installments or at community centers. There is already underway an installation at the UT Butterfly Farm going on that will actually be attached to a not part of this project, but a kitchen that is teaching tribal members how to cook traditional meals or integrate plants, native plants into their cooking. And it's going to compile this knowledge about how tribes have traditionally dealt with climatic extremes and develop new knowledge within that population, so that those persons can not only be aware of how to deal with climate change, but can maybe develop knowledge around things like wastewater gardens that can be put into commercial use. And that is the end of that.